Hi everyone. My name is Eugene Brennan and I'm a senior lecturer and program director of the International Politics degree at the University of London Institute in Paris. This evening I'm going to give you a taster course, which as the name suggests will hopefully give you a taster or a flavour of the type of thing you study on our programme. And the title of the class tonight is Liberalism and the Crisis of the Liberal International Order. Liberalism is a core theory for studying international politics. And if you take the degree with us in the first weeks of your studies, you will examine a number of core theories, such as liberalism, but also realism, Marxism, post-colonial theory, and other theories for understanding the international system. Liberalism is often contrasted to realism. So just for starters, I'm going to give you just a little bit of a flavor of what that means. Realists tend to think that nation states analyze the international political system as a system that tends towards competitiveness, and that competitiveness is the best way for states to guarantee their interests. On the contrary, liberals tend to think that cooperation is the best way to guarantee a state's interests, cooperating with other states, that it's in the nation's interests to pursue the global good. So that's just a little bit of a flavor, but I'm going to look at that in more detail in this course. And in particular, we're going to look at this notion of the liberal international order, which is the kind of a description that's used to describe the key alliances and relationships and institutions of Western politics since the second half of the 20th century. Now, this order, if you look at the news in recent times, over the past couple of years, it's said to be crumbling. It's said to be in a state of crisis, as you'll see from various headlines that I've taken from the press in recent years, from foreign affairs magazines, from newspapers like The Guardian, Middle East Affairs and beyond. And there's various reasons for this. As you can see, one obvious reason at the moment is the genocide in Gaza, but we could also point to what's been happening in Ukraine and Sudan, and the failure really for Western institutions to hold those accountable for these war crimes, which is really being seen as a kind of a core source of decline of the international order. So it's just a little bit of a flavor, but I'm going to go to that in much more detail. Today's lecture, just to summarize what we're going to cover, why is this order said to be in crisis? What is the theory underpinning it? So to understand a bit more about liberalism, it's a contested theory of IR. The word liberalism itself, it can mean different things in different political contexts. For example, if someone's called a liberal in the United States, it tends to be associated with the political left and values of kind of human rights, welfare, and so on. But if the word is used in France, for example, it's interesting that it's actually more associated with the right. And the reason for that is because it tends to emphasize this question of economic liberalism, the idea that investment of public goods should come from private actors rather than from the state, let's say. So the term itself can mean different things to different people. Liberalism itself is contested, and I'm going to look at that in the context of IR over the course of this taster class. Yeah, I'm going to, as I've given you a few kind of examples from recent politics. In the class I'm about to give, I'm going to kind of do a dive into the historical context of the 20th century and the post-Second World War moments. And then at the end of the lecture, I'm going to bring that back to contemporary politics and some recent developments. Okay, so sorry, I should just say that in terms of the structure, we're going to go for about 45 minutes. And so we'll finish at around 5:45, and we'll have 10 or 15 minutes then for questions. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Okay, so the kind of foundations of the liberal international order, a good moment to start is right after or even during the Second World War, particularly the Atlantic Charter, which was seen as a kind of a foundational document that led to what we know today as the United Nations. So this was a joint declaration in 1941 of the presidents of the United States of America and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill. And in this declaration, it notes, for example, that after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, the signatories hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries. They desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field. So you can see straight away here that the context of the war, the destruction of the Second World War, is really influential upon nation states seeking to establish an order in which peace is absolutely central, and in which that peace is guaranteed by cooperation, or as you can see, the language here used in this quotation is collaboration. They also link that collaboration. It's only a question of kind of collaboration on the level of politics and peace, but they link it to economics. And that's really important in the development of post-war liberalism, that political benefits and economic benefits will go hand in hand. So this foundational declaration was followed by the Declaration of the United Nations, which was, of course, the basis of the United Nations, and then the UN Charter in 1945. Other principles that came up in the Atlantic Charter, I mentioned kind of the establishment of peace. I'm just going to read, I'm not going to read all of them, but there's several that we can note. One in particular, which says that all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as for spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. They believe that the disarmament of such nations is essential. So again, this language of disarmament, of peace, of trying to reconstruct an order in the aftermath of the destruction of war is really kind of key here. And the language of even how the United States, for example, conducts its domestic politics is interesting in this regard. They had a Department of War, and they changed it for a department kind of titled around defense. Interestingly, that switched back to the language of war under the Trump administration just this September, under a change to the name that I'll speak about a bit more in the conclusion. Okay, so I'm going to take just a few examples of key institutions and key developments with regards to building up this so-called liberal international order. As I mentioned, it wasn't only political, it was also economic. And one key development here is the Bretton Woods Conference that took place in New Hampshire in the United States in 1944. And this conference was sort of used as a means of reconciling economic free trade policies with domestic Keynesian policies. So what we mean by Keynesian policies, it refers to the economist John Maynard Keynes. And to put it very simply, it means the state investing massively, using massive kind of public funds to generate economic growth. So it's a bit of a contrast in what we've seen in recent decades in terms of neoliberalism, and we see kind of more of an emphasis on private investments and privatization. And here in the mid-20th century, particularly from the early to mid-20th century, Keynesianism was a kind of a dominant economic idea. So how to reconcile this emphasis on public state growth with capitalism, really, with kind of free market capitalism, with the growth of markets, and with free trade across borders as well. That was a key kind of idea behind the conference. Another idea behind the conference as well was that the United States wanted to establish the supremacy of the dollar as a currency. And that doesn't mean that all nation states, for example, would adopt the dollar, but it means that other nation states would use the dollar as a kind of as a measure of convertibility, that they could convert their currency to the dollar using kind of low interest rates. So facilitating currency convertibility, obviously kind of advantageous with regards to free trade. Now, just to give you, I'm not going to go into too much of the detail of the economic theory here, but just to give you an example of how this was a major historical and political change, I want to highlight on your screen here the change in language of the United States presidents over the course of a relatively short time span. For example, Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 noted that the sound internal economic system of a nation is a greater factor in its well-being than the prices of its currency. So in this quotation from 33, Roosevelt is really emphasizing, as the word I've highlighted here, internal. He's not looking outwards to the international, he's looking at the priorities of domestic national politics. This is quite a contrast with what Roosevelt says at Bretton Woods in 1944. He says that the economic health of every country is a proper matter of concern to all its neighbors, near and distant. So it's a real change in perspective here, because he's implying in this second quotation that our well-being is actually intrinsically bound up with the well-being of other nation states, be they near or far. So we see a move away from economic protectionism, from a kind of economic nationalism, if you like, towards a much more multilateral but also international perspective on regards to economics, but also this very much feeds into politics, as we'll see as well. So this quotation is taken from a key theorist of liberal politics, John J. Eikenberry, from his article, A World Economy Restored. Okay, so Bretton Woods, one example of building up this kind of consensus with regards to economic ideas around liberalism and the liberal international order. Another aspect I want to emphasize is the idea of a rules-based order. So you might have heard this phrase. President Truman in 1949 used it. He talks about how a rules-bound international trading regime will mean that all countries, including our own, quote, will greatly benefit from a constructive program for the better use of the world's human and natural resources. So again, this idea that my well-being is bound up with your well-being, and Truman and sort of the US are starting to think about this in terms of what's called a rules-bound international trading regime. I don't need to say that at this stage, but I'm sure you can see the contrast with the kind of perspective and the ruling style of the current US presidents, who would not use this kind of language at all and has a very different style. Italy's Minister of Foreign Affairs at the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty signing similarly noted that no nation in the world can feel secure in its prosperity and peace if all its neighbors are not as safely marching towards the same goals of prosperity and security. So again, the kind of the aftermath of World War II is quite significant here. Nazism could be seen as a kind of an extreme kind of right-wing form of nationalism, which discredits extreme nationalism for the international community. And you can see that even world leaders here are expressing a kind of a discursive suspicion towards nationalist ideology and trying to kind of talk about self-interested concerns in the language of internationalism. So another key development and institution with regards to the liberal international order is NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they're kind of the ideology of NATO is sometimes referred to as Atlanticism. And NATO is essentially a military alliance, basically a system of collective security, whereby its independent member states agree to mutual defense in response to an attack by any external party. And NATO, this kind of Atlantic alliance, it basically replaced national defense systems in Western Europe for many decades. So it's quite an interesting point. And again, it's a link with the contemporary moment. We see it as a sticking point with the current US presidents, who wants more investment, not just from EU countries, but from the states as well in the military alliance. So Article 5, it's a famous article sometimes cited from the Atlantic Treaty, and it states that an armed attack against one member shall be considered as an attack against them all. So this kind of this is an example of a core feature of liberalism, which is what theorists call security co-binding. So the security of one state is tied to and bound up with that of other states. And it's this idea that we build up institutions which are mutually constraining, which impose rules upon us, but by us adhering to these rules, we gain benefits from them as well. It's not just about policing our own behavior. This is a recent article from IR scholar Paul Post, in which he said that Article 4 is the new Article 5. So Article 4 uses slightly weaker language than Article 5. It states that the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political dependence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. And Post notes that in the recent cases of Poland and Estonia, invoking the clause was an opportunity to convene the North Atlantic Council, a decision-making body of NATO, in order to determine how best to provide assistance, particularly with regards to Russian aggression. So as a result of this invocation, the Council established Operation Eastern Sentry, which led to allies sending a host of air defense and air monitoring platforms to Poland and other countries on NATO's eastern flank. Okay, so that's a little bit about NATO, a little bit about Bretton Woods. So we've got a bit about the political, the military, the economic. So all this, as I've been emphasizing, building up the kind of the logics of reciprocity and cooperation, in which treating everyone as a potential enemy is seen as bringing the risk of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And at this point, before I go on, I should maybe contextualize by saying that liberals here, they're really having a dialogue or a debate with another core set of theorists of IR, and that's realists. So just to briefly introduce what realism proposes so that we can better understand what the liberals are saying here. Realists argue that the international political system is an anarchic system. And that doesn't mean when they say it's anarchic or it's defined by anarchy, anarchy is not the exact same thing as chaos. Because anarchy can have a kind of an order, it just means that order is not vertical. So this might sound very abstract, but just to make it like tangible, in domestic politics within nation states, there's generally a clear vertical order of power. You might have executive and judicial branches of power. Then there are policing authorities and other authorities that mean that excuse me, sorry, just checking some detail here. Sorry, just bear with me for one moment. Just having a slight technical glitch here. Yeah, sorry about that. So realists basically say that this international system does not basically have the same vertical power structure that states have. So states have very clear decision makers and authorities like police, judges, executive branches of power, and so on. But when it comes to international politics, we don't have a clear decider beyond the nation state. I mean, we have seen the rise of institutions like the European Union and the United Nations, but these institutions have not really replaced the nation state when it comes to core decision making and constraining. Think, for example, even of COVID, the pandemic a couple of years back. That was a global pandemic, that was a global problem. And logically, one would say we need to coordinate globally to decide on how to deal with this. But in practice, what happened is that different nation states ended up having different policies with regards to lockdowns, curfews, and then vaccines and so on. So still, when it comes to these global problems, we see that the nation state does not have a kind of a clear constraining authority beyond it. And for realists, they'll say that means that the nation state will act in such a way to maximize its own self-interests, and it will see as defense and security as a priority, and it will see other nation states as competitors that they should be suspicious of. And realists think that the best way of guaranteeing their own self-interests is by maximizing their own security, defense, and economic interests, and really acting competitively and not in terms of cooperation with regards to other states. So it's kind of realists, they're called realists for a name. They don't have a very kind of rose-tinted view of the world, let's say, and morality does not really play any part in decision-making from the perspective of realists. It's not to say that morality is irrelevant, but with good kind of rationale, really, they kind of say that state actors don't really bring morality into decision-making, they bring their own self-interest. So here in this slide, I'm just bringing out for you how some of the liberal theorists disagree with this. They talk about how the order of liberalism is kind of rules-based and not really organized into kind of rival blocks or exclusive regional spheres. For liberals, what states can and cannot do is not determined purely by power, but by international law and shared rules. So I might come back to this point in the conclusion, because I think that there's good reason to think that this is breaking down. What we are seeing in recent politics is more and more often the use of power and brute force rather than shared rules with regards to major political upheavals, unfortunately. But for liberals, for a part of the 20th century, they thought that on the contrary, international law was kind of a good guarantor of state action. So again, unlike realists, which I just briefly introduced, and normally we spend several weeks on this kind of theory at ULIP, so don't worry if this is kind of a little bit, you're finding this over your head right now. We'll study this in more detail on the course. But unlike realists, liberals will suggest that the national self-interest can be achieved through and reconciled with pursuit of the global good. The realists think that politics is a zero-sum game, like I said, the competitive logic I referred to, but liberals think that actually we can attain global good through national self-interestedness. That summarizes here, this slide, a couple of the issues I've been highlighting so far. I don't think I'll go over them in too much detail right now because I've given you a good flavor of them. So I might start to move on a little bit. So with regards to security then, realists would say that institutions like NATO and the United Nations offer a false promise of security, that they're really kind of a smokescreen, and that they won't guarantee security for nations when push comes to shove, when you've got kind of a rival great power infringing upon nation security. However, liberals would respond to this by saying that institutions are beneficial for security because they increase the level of information available to all parties, they enhance transparency, they raise the costs of defection, and they clarify what constitutes defection. So this is an interesting point, or a set of points here. For example, like if realists say that states will react to the security threat of an aggressor, the question becomes, well, how do we know what constitutes a security threat? What is a red line? Where is a red line? And when are we in a kind of a danger zone? So institutions, liberals insist, will clarify that kind of detail and thus be beneficial for each other in thwarting potential threats. Okay, so there's a branch of liberalism then, and sorry, I'm conscious that I'm going into quite a little bit of theoretical detail here, so I'm not going to, we're nearly finished with the theory. I'm going to give you plenty of real world examples now to kind of test some of this out. Just one final part of the theory is what's called neoliberal institutionalism. This is a branch of liberal thought, and it posits that the anarchic nature of the international system prompts states to seek multilateral cooperation. So I mentioned this anarchic nature of the international system earlier, that unlike domestic politics, we don't have a global policeman or a global judicial authority or executive authority. So that anarchic kind of structure means that states will seek security via multilateral cooperation. Institutions are also beneficial because they provide legitimacy for states. If you have institutional approval for a particular kind of nation-state action, well, then that kind of covers your tracks to an extent. It leaves a state less exposed to international law, less exposed to aggressors and other sorts of threats. Like I said, these institutions can inform cost-benefit decision-making, and it lowers the cost of collective action as well. If you build a consensus with other actors acting with you, it means that you can share the burden, basically, of what that action might be. There was a case study. Just briefly over the next slide or two, we might look at US-Iraq relations over the kind of period from 1991 to 2003. And the reason I'm going to take this as examples because this was a period of action for the US within the UN following the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, which showed the potential for existing cooperative mechanisms of international security to work. So we're in the aftermath of the Cold War here. Freed from the geostrategic constraints of the Cold War, the UN had become a central focus of coalition building. So between the 2nd of August and the 29th of November 1990, 12 resolutions condemning Iraq were passed by the United Nations Security Council, including a strong sanctions regime. So implementing sanctions upon Iraq as a kind of a coercive mechanism for pursuing their aims. So the US saw major benefits in and achieved legitimacy by liberating Kuwait and holding Saddam Hussein accountable for so-called weapons of mass destruction programs via the United Nations. The UN did not play a major part in the 1991 coalition warfighting, but the UN mandate helped the US lead a coalition of 30 countries and achieve burden sharing. So as you can see on your screen here, you know, the UN was kind of useful to an extent to the US at this stage. The US was really like a hegemonic actor in global politics. It had essentially won the Cold War, so to speak. It was really seen as a kind of, the 1990s were kind of seen as a real triumphal moment for liberalism and the US-led liberal international order. However, the US's relationship to the international community was not one of complete domination. It was one where it used institutions to pursue its own ends. So US power wasn't one of kind of brute force all the time, although it sometimes did use military power, but it used these institutions to pursue its goals. So the UN was very useful to the US at the time. Weapons inspections and sanctions coordinated by the UN were pursued throughout the 1990s. These developments from the perspective of liberal theorists illustrate how international institutions can enhance national security objectives. However, a problem emerges from the end of the 1990s because Iraq is basically seen as complying with the weapons inspectors. Weapons inspectors withdraw in 1998, but from the US perspective, Iraq remains an uncertain case. And this becomes very, very evident in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. In the aftermath of these attacks, we have the George Bush kind of led, George W. Bush, excuse me, the global war on terror. So in the context of the global war on terror, regime change in Iraq becomes a priority. But this is quite strange as a priority in that context because the 9/11 attacks were led by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization that did not have any direct affiliation with Iraq. So the logic here was not clear, like what was going on here. And the justification that the Bush administration tried to use for the Iraq invasion was a combination of the fact that there was a suspicion that the Saddam Hussein regime was hiding weapons of mass destruction that could be detrimental for neighboring or far-reaching nation states. And there was also the suggestion that there was a link to transnational terrorists networks, and that there was some kind of connection between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda, or that Iraq had been kind of harboring terrorists. Problem for the US is that there was no evidence of either. They weren't able to find or justify any evidence in this regard. Colin Powell made a very controversial speech to the United Nations, in which, after the fact, it was kind of found that the evidence, the so-called evidence from the intelligence community, was greatly exaggerated of a threat from Iraq. But the administration continued to try to convince the UN of the case for invading. George W. Bush told the UN in February 2002, we created the UN Security Council so that, unlike the League of Nations, our deliberations will be more than talk, our resolutions will be more than wishes. But then in March 17th of 2003, the White House spokesman says that the UN has failed to enforce its own demands that Iraq immediately disarm. As a result, the diplomatic window has now been closed. And on March 19th, the US-led coalition invades Iraq. So what happens? Weapons inspectors found no evidence of WMDs, of weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration could not get countries like France and the UN on board. So what did they do? They basically bypassed the UN and they went about things through their own kind of coalition. So the consequences of the war in Iraq, I'm not sure if anyone's kind of studied this a little bit. It's kind of a long way off for you now, I'm sure. But the consequences were quite devastating. You're no doubt aware of the rise of the so-called Islamic State in the 2010s. And Islamic State, or ISIS, was really an organization that found its origins in US-led Iraqi prisoner of war camps in the aftermath of the US invasion. So there's a kind of a direct link between the US-led invasion of Iraq and the rise of this sort of extreme form of terrorism we saw in the 2010s with ISIS. The costs of the war were absolutely massive for the Iraqi people, the civilian deaths, and not only civilian deaths, but just the kind of the regional kind of upheaval that we've seen since then. So why am I highlighting all this? Well, from the perspective of liberals or so-called neoliberal institutionalists, they'd say that this is an outcome we could have foreseen. They would say that, it's obvious that it was going to go bad by not seeking kind of the legitimacy of institutions. In its invasion of Iraq, Sean Kay explains in this article, the US paid a high cost for failing to listen to or rely on the information gathering of existing international institutions. The result was decreased US national security, not to mention the detrimental outcomes, of course, for Iraqi people and for regional politics. All of that's an outcome that according to Sean Kay, neoliberal institutional theory could have anticipated. Okay, so that just zooming out a little bit to the wider context, like I said, the 1990s was a moment of great triumphalism for liberalism, exemplified in particular by this book by Francis Fukuyama, a scholar who wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And in this book, he kind of says that the end of the Cold War is essentially kind of the end of history. He's being a little bit rhetorical here. He's exaggerating a bit. When he says the end of history, he doesn't mean literally history's over, but he does mean that major geopolitical struggles, major ideological struggles are kind of finished because, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Marxism has kind of collapsed. Any other major competing ideology seems to have kind of collapsed, and all that's really left is liberalism as defined and led by the US. However, if you look at any kind of political commentary from even the past decade, this viewpoint is kind of discredited. It was widely believed at the time of the 1990s, but in recent years, as we can see from this article in the New York Times, this kind of triumphalism seemed to be a misreading of the situation, as we've seen the return of great power politics with the kind of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've seen the collapse of a kind of a US-led sort of liberal international order, and all sorts of other kind of conflicts and upheavals that once again bring ideological and geopolitical conflicts back onto the table. This is a slightly, what I find a slightly amusing image I thought I would just put up to show you just how much politics has changed over the past 20 to 30 years. This is an image from the G8 summit in, is it 2001, I think? And you can see Vladimir Putin with the UK Prime Minister of the time, Tony Blair, and then some rock pop musicians, Bono from U2 and Bob Geldof. And the image is quite striking because Putin today is known as a kind of an enemy of the West, an enemy of the kind of Atlantic alliance between the US and the UK. And such an image is kind of surreal from our perspective today, to see him kind of there with a kind of UK Prime Minister on friendly terms with some rock stars. But at the turn of the 21st century, Russia was being incorporated into the kind of the liberal order and was flirting with the idea of this cooperative relationship with the West. So I just put that up as a kind of a contrast with where we're at today. So in a recent commentary for Foreign Policy magazine, Stephen Walt talked about how this kind of consensus around liberalism from the 1990s is now over. That in fact liberalism, it's not won the kind of geopolitical kind of conflict, it's actually in decline. And this quote here is quite harsh with regards to liberalism. He said that, you know, the idea that democracy would continue to spread, that barriers to trade would continue to decline, that nationalism would fade, all that was completely outdated. Because what we're seeing in recent years is not the decline of nationalism and so on, as predicted by liberals, but in fact we've seen the return of nationalism, both political and economic, exemplified by all sorts of developments. You know, in the UK context, we can look around the tensions with the European Union, the Brexit vote, the return of a kind of a more nationalist politics there. In the US context, the kind of slogans like "Make America Great Again" and beyond, there seems to be a greater emphasis on the nation state and the rise of public suspicion towards liberal international cooperation. Of course, liberalism is also discredited in the context of Gaza over the past 2 years, because here, like liberalism, also part of its legitimacy was a moral legitimacy. The liberal international order, it vaunted human rights and civil rights. It vaunted the question of rights, welfare, and human well-being through these institutions and the kind of humanitarian discourse they often proposed. And it was often seen as contradictory and hypocritical, but that kind of level of hypocrisy reached kind of spectacular heights over the past couple of years. You know, it's well summed up in the title of this book by Didier Fassan, Moral Abdication, How the World Failed to Stop the Destruction of Gaza. And of course, the West didn't just fail to stop the destruction of Gaza, it was complicit in that destruction through, you know, arms shipments, through the failure to sanction the Israeli governments, despite the facts of kind of rulings of genocide and war crimes by institutions such as the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the ICC, which picked out Netanyahu as well as others from the Israeli regime and from Hamas as kind of guilty of war crimes. So none of these sorts of these rulings have really been supported by some of the most powerful actors of the so-called liberal international order. And that means that the very word liberalism, it barely has meaning in this context. Another context to think about as well is Trump's kind of attacks in recent weeks and months, there have been attacks sanctioned by the Trump administration on fishing vessels in the Pacific who have been described as being drug dealers or potentially bringing drugs into the United States. So it's these kind of basically extrajudicial killings have been approved by Trump, and they've also gone hand in hand with the kind of a ramping up of threatening discourse with regards to Venezuela and other regimes that are seen as kind of hostile to the Trump administration's interests at the moment. And this is kind of seen as a decline of the liberal international order as well, because the US is doing things like, I mean, powerful nations, they've always done sometimes things like extrajudicial killings, but they've at least tried to masquerade it using the language of international law or through seeking some sort of international consensus. And now the US is not even trying, it's not even making the bare effort to couch these actions in so-called moral or sort of ethical well-being. It's just using brute force to pursue its interests. So that's seen as kind of key developments in liberalism being in crisis. So I'm coming to the end of my lecture, and I'll sum it up in a few minutes through a few bullet points here, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So to sum up then why liberalism and the liberal international order are seen as being in crisis today, well, we've got a decline in multilateralism. So multilateralism is kind of states kind of working together through institutions like the United Nations, or the European Union, and others. So we've seen a manifest decline in this, and instead we've seen a decline, we've seen a rise in kind of the return of power politics, of figures like Putin and Trump pursuing aggressive actions without seeking consent from other states via these institutions. We've seen the end of any semblance of moral credibility on the part of the liberal international order, complicity in genocide in Gaza. We can also point to what's going on in Sudan in recent times. On the case of Sudan, where the RSF, who are committing mass murders, committing also genocidal actions, using weapons that are coming from the United Arab Emirates, and some of these weapons as well are coming from Western countries. So there's the question of how the Western order might be kind of, you know, passively complicit in contexts like this as well. The Russian war in Ukraine, but the Russian war in Ukraine is actually an interesting one because it could be seen as an example of liberalism or the liberal order being in crisis. But the Russian war in Ukraine has also been a kind of an opportunity to try to salvage some vestiges of liberal cooperation, particularly with regards to rearmament in Europe and the NATO alliance in particular, NATO becoming more prominent in international politics again. So this is an interesting one, which could be seen as kind of both an example of the crisis of liberalism, but also a possibility of some sort of return of liberalism. Now, here's where history is really important, because I guess I'm here talking about some of the kind of the hypocrisy of liberalism or of its contradictions. I've also tried to point out its strengths and its benefits in the context of neoliberal institutionalism. But liberalism was always contradictory. There was always a hypocritical element to it here, because in a post-war period, the US was vaunting liberal principles with the US liberal international order. But what was it doing at home? We had a principle in the United States of racial segregation, of Jim Crow laws, of explicitly racist domestic policies. And that was like a patently absurd contradiction, that you would vaunt human rights on the international stage, but you would have a formalized racial segregation in domestic politics. And that contradiction was used quite cleverly by civil rights and Black Power activists. You know, Malcolm X, for example, famously talked about human rights as a way of undermining this kind of contradiction of the US's so-called liberal policy. So there's always that contradiction in liberalism, but today the US seems to be even abandoning the pretense to international legal norms. So we could say like there's always that hypocritical or contradictory element there, but there was at least an attempt to, in discourse or appearance, adhere to legal norms, international norms, to the rules-based order. And as I've just alluded to with the example of these extraditional killings of Trump, the example of Venezuela, the example of Gaza, and other contexts around the world, here we see almost an abandonment of any kind of semblance of norms. We're also seeing the so-called illiberal turn of nominally liberal states. So what I mean by that is it's not just the kind of like, let's say, figures like Trump or parties that represent the historic far right that are kind of a threat to liberalism. We also see nominally liberal politicians and regimes pursuing illiberal policies. You know, France under Emmanuel Macron is an interesting example. Macron, someone who's kind of vaunted liberal principles, but under his reign, policing in France has been kind of targeted by Amnesty International as being kind of infringing upon like the human rights of not only protesters but of journalists covering protests. In the context of the Yellow Vests, there's journalists who lost eyes, who had severe kind of physical damage to their bodies because of the weapons used by police and the aggressive policing that's being used here, and that nominally wouldn't really be part of a so-called liberal state. Another reason why liberalism is in crisis is because of the failure of its economic policies with regards to the Washington Consensus. You probably won't be familiar with what that is. Some of you might have covered it in school, but probably not. And I won't have time to go into it right now. But basically what it meant is that institutions like the International Monetary Fund gave money to third world countries, and they gave them money to try to cover their debts, but they gave them that money with a huge amount of conditions, which included massive interest rates for your payments, and included restructuring their economies, often kind of gutting the public sector and opening up to kind of capital interests. And that's had a devastating effect on countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, but you know, many African countries and countries around the world. So I don't have the time to cover it right now, but economically, liberalism is seen as kind of less credible because of that, also because of the 2008 financial crash, but other reasons we could point to. Okay, I've covered quite a bit today, probably bombarded you with too much information. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk. And right now we've got a bit of time for questions, so I can open things up to questions. Happy to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so we do have a couple of questions. The first question we have, after everything, can we receive certificates?
Okay, so is this with regards to this taster course or regards to, maybe they've not specified, regards to the degree program?
Yeah, let's assume for the program.
Yeah, well, yeah, so it's not the case for the taster course. For the program, what you receive is a BA degree at the end. So you get a piece of paper, your BA degree, which basically is a kind of, it's sort of advantageous with regards to applying for jobs, as well as applying for postgraduate courses, whether it be masters or other kinds of programs of study students might go on to. So I might just say a brief word about that, because I'm sure students are interested about what kind of things graduates of our degree go on to do. So I've got a lot of students right now who are applying for master's programs in international politics. And I've got students who go on to do work in areas like public policy, work with non-governmental organizations, work in the civil service, state departments in the UK or in France. So there is that direct link. Obviously, you do an international politics degree, you might work in politics affiliated sectors. But we've also got a huge amount of students who do quite different things at the end. And that's quite common. You know, if you do a history degree, you're not necessarily going to be a historian. If you do a politics degree, you're not going to be a politician. So we get a good mix between students who do go on to politics affiliated kind of career paths, but it's very interdisciplinary, and it teaches you skills that are very applicable and useful in all sorts of different professions. That could be kind of in journalism, could be in law, It could be in the private sector, economics, all sorts of career paths. So all that to say, yeah, you've got a lot of different options for what you might do afterwards.
Thank you. Awesome. Next question. What is the length of the lectures and how many lectures are there a week for this course?
Okay, good question. Yeah, so the traditional length for a lecture is 1 hour. So what you have is you'll have several modules in your first year, and for each module you'll have 1 hour of lecture and 1 hour of seminar. So in the lecture, it might be mostly, for example, I might give a lecture, it might be mostly me talking. There could be 40 of you in a classroom, 50 in a lecture theatre. But then you'll have a seminar in which it'll be much more interactive and there'll be much more student work. And that might take the form of analyzing texts. It might be students having debates, it might be student presentations. It could be, yeah, all sorts of activity like that. So we've got the lecture seminar format for most of our modules, but we've also got something unique as part of this program, which is that each year there's one module that has a slightly different teaching format. They're called learning labs, and they're 3-hour sessions per week. And the purpose of these sessions is basically to get beyond the particular teacher-led format and to make student learning much more central. So that means you do a lot of peer review work, working together on research projects, comparing your research projects with each other, giving each other feedback about your progress in these projects, and also going out into Paris actually and studying politics in the city. We make a lot of use of the city around us as part of this degree, because it's a degree in international politics, and Paris is a hugely international city. So in year 2 of your learning lab, you will go to specific international sites or institutions in the city, specific museums, places in the city where politically significant things happen. You'll visit them, analyze them, and then go back to the classroom and talk together about how that kind of lived, embodied experience of the city allows you to better understand some of these kind of conceptual issues of politics you've been studying in the classroom. So I should say number of hours a week, then it's, if you do the BA and IP in first year, it's 9 hours per week. If you're interested in French studies, so with French studies as a minor, you've got a little bit extra, you've got 11 hours a week.
Thank you. Our next question, in the course, are there any trips to international places of interest, political organizations, i.e. British Embassy, Strasbourg, and the like?
Yeah, great question. So we've got a couple of things to say here. We've got a model UN society. So that's a society that it's like a model United Nations, and it involves students participating in kind of model UN conferences with other students, sometimes in Paris, sometimes elsewhere, having these kind of like kind of simulated debates as part of a kind of a conference. And that's currently an extracurricular activity. It's so far we've had trips where students have gone to Brussels. Last year we had some students go on a trip to New York with a lecturer. But what we're doing as part of the program that you're going to take is that we're embedding it a bit more into the program. And in year 2, that means that you're going to have a module on international institutions in which you'll have the opportunity to do a model UN conference. That conference will probably take place in Paris with other students in Paris. But we link up with the Model UN Society with the extracurricular work and give students the possibility to do one of these trips to places like to Brussels or elsewhere. So that's one key trip, so to speak. The other opportunity for trips is, like I said, on the year 2 module on sites of international politics, in which you go to places like, you'll go to museums in the city, you'll go to like the Museum of Immigration, you'll also go to museums, the Holocaust Museum, Holocaust Memorial, and other sites of the city as well where kind of interesting things have happened. Yeah, so apart from those 2 key modules, we also embed sites in other modules as well and try and get out as much as possible.
Thank you. Next question, how are the modules examined? So is it coursework, exams?
Yep. Yeah, another very good question. So the coursework, it's continuous assessments, and there's quite different types of assignments. But just to give you an example, like the course I just gave you on liberalism, that's kind of based on what I do with my year one students, and it's a module called Doing International Politics, Theories and Actors. And it's a year-long module, and so it's 2 terms. Over the course of those 2 terms, you'd have 3 assessments. At the end of term 1, there's an exam. In term 2, you'll have an oral presentation, which is like a podcast discussion, recorded presentation. And at the end of term 2, you've got an essay. So that's quite typical. Over the course of 1 year-long module, you'll have maybe an exam, oral presentation, and end of year essay. I should say there aren't that many exams. When we first launched the program, we didn't have any, but we've brought them in for a bit of diversity. We've got a lot of research essays, often end of year essays, and the way they're often organized as well is that you'll often have like an essay plan to submit as preparation for that essay. But we've also got different sorts of assignments like a source analysis where you need to analyze a text, or in year 2 you'll have like a learning log, a portfolio where you reflect upon the learning you've done in class and submit that to your lecturer. And what else do we have? We've got quite a variety, but off the top of my head, there's some of the major ones, and all that to say, it's the kind of like continuous assessment model.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Can liberalism and nationalism ever coexist within the international system, or is it dependent on the form that it is embraced?
Great question. Yeah, really good question. In theory, liberalism and nationalism are opposed, because nationalism is all about kind of drawing the boundaries of the nation state, and it's focused upon internal kind of domestic politics, so to speak. Whereas liberalism, even the word like liberal, it's kind of like liberalizing, let's say, economically trade restrictions, opening up barriers, the free movement of goods and money, but also of people moving across borders. So they seem to be opposed in theory, but in practice, they've often gone hand in hand, in fact. Liberalism can sometimes be a means for nations to achieve their own nationalist goals. However, I think extreme nationalism, it's very difficult to reconcile with a facade of liberalism. When you kind of go for a kind of a hard nationalism, it very often means, hostile policies with regards to migration, and also hostile policies with regards to economics, the return of like economic protectionism, and tariffs on the import and export of goods, which liberals don't really like. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure if that answers fully what you're looking for, but all that to say, I think sometimes these contradictions can be reconciled, but hard nationalism is certainly in practice hostile to liberalism.
Thank you, Eugene. I know they did ask if we could return back to the slide on the rules-based order.
Okay.
But just to know that
Mm.
this video will be available for recording after, so you can always go back and have a look and look through. But yeah, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your time, Eugene. Any questions that weren't answered, we will send a post comms out and send any of the responses on those comms to you guys as well. And there will be a survey just as soon as we're done. So please fill this out so that we can get some feedback on how you found the session. Thank you all.
Okay. Thanks, Hannah, for your help. And
No
thanks very much,
worries.
everyone, for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.